After I got pregnant, I kept working. Right up until the moment my husband's mistress tried to fire me for using the bathroom too many times. I kept working, which tells you everything you need to know about the kind of woman I was before everything happened, and nothing at all about the kind I became after. Aldrich and I started with nothing. Two broke university students sharing a studio apartment and a single ambition. I sold my parents' apartment, my inheritance, every square foot of the only home I had ever known, and put every cent into a startup because I believed in us with the total conviction of someone who has not yet learned that belief requires evidence. For 6 years I was the company. I landed every major client, built every key relationship, pushed through flu seasons and all-nighters and a pregnancy that had me vomiting 10 times a day. When Evergreen Holdings, the deal that would make us the top firm in Northwood, finally confirmed their partnership, I was so depleted I collapsed on the street outside the office and woke up in a hospital bed. I discharged myself early and went back to close the deal. I believed we were building something together. I believed it so completely that I missed every sign that Aldrich had already decided what came next. The facial recognition failure should have told me everything. I stood at the entrance of the company I had co-founded and funded with my parents' apartment, and the system looked at my face and did not recognize me as someone who belonged there. I found an intern to let me in. I walked to my office and found my things in the trash, my photos of Aldrich and me defaced with black marker, and Tiffany, his assistant, his mistress, sitting at my desk pulling up 3 months of bathroom surveillance footage like a prosecutor building a case. I listened to her explain company policy in the office I had chosen the furniture for, then walked to Aldrich's office, where he handed me a termination letter without quite meeting my eyes and told me to go home and rest. I looked at the floor. The lace thong was still there, half tucked under his couch, vivid and incriminating, and he either hadn't noticed or had decided it didn't matter. The Evergreen deal was signed. The company was number one. The dream was realized. And I, having served my function, was being discarded. He had told me 6 months ago he wanted to get married at our most glorious moment. This was apparently not what he had meant by that. I slapped the termination letter across his face. Then I walked out and called Daniel Shu. Daniel was our biggest competitor, had watched me build Aldrich's company for years with the professional admiration of someone who recognized talent operating below its correct altitude. He picked up on the second ring. When I laid out the proposition, the Evergreen Holdings deal, transferred to his firm, signed tomorrow, making him the top company in Northwood by end of week, he went quiet, then said, "Are you having problems with Aldrich?" I said I was having a clarity moment. He laughed and said he'd have contracts ready by 9 the next morning. I spent that night in a hotel, sitting on the bed with my laptop and phone, making calls because I had spent 6 years building relationships in this industry, and those relationships belonged to me and not to any company letterhead. By midnight, I had a clearer picture of the future than I'd had in months. I also had a text from Aldrich that said, "Don't do anything stupid, Serena," which I read once and did not reply to. It was not a message from someone who was sorry. It was a message from someone who still believed he was managing me, and that belief was about to become very expensive for him. The 9 o'clock meeting with Daniel went smoothly. Evergreen Holdings' key contact was Margaret Voss, 63 years old, who had always dealt with me personally, and who said without hesitation when I called her the previous evening that her loyalty was to me and not to a firm name. She arrived at Daniel's office at 10, shook my hand warmly, and signed everything in under 40 minutes. By noon, Daniel's firm was the top company in Northwood, and Aldrich's was not. Daniel asked me to dinner 3 weeks later, framing it as a business celebration, which was plausible enough that I accepted. It was business for approximately 45 minutes before he set down his wine glass and said, with the directness of someone who considers hedging a waste of time, that he had been professionally impressed by me for 3 years and personally interested for at least 2 of them and thought I should know that. He said it cleanly, no pressure built into the sentence. Just the fact of it, offered and left there. I looked at him across the table and felt something I hadn't expected, not indifference, which would have been simpler, but genuine warmth that made what I was about to say harder than it should have been. Daniel Shu was a good man, and the timing was, in the way of most things that arrive slightly wrong, genuinely painful. I told him the truth. I said that under different circumstances the answer might have been entirely different, and I meant that completely. But I had a company to build from scratch and a daughter arriving in 4 months and a version of myself still being excavated from the wreckage of 6 years, and I was not willing to bring someone I actually respected into the middle of that reconstruction. He deserved better than being someone's stability project. I needed everything I had, every unit of energy, every clear-headed morning for the work and for her, and anything else was a dilution I couldn't afford. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, simply, "Okay," not wounded, not pushing, just the quiet dignity of someone who had asked an honest question, received an honest answer, and could accept that. He refilled my water glass and asked about my plans for the firm's first quarter, and the evening ended warmly and without residue. He sent a plant to the office when I registered the company. A large fiddle-leaf fig with a card that said for the new office. "Don't overwater it." I put it by the window. We have coffee occasionally now, easy and uncomplicated, and it is one of the better outcomes available to that dinner conversation. The legal process took 4 months. Discovery was where the architecture of the betrayal became fully visible. Aldrich had been involved with Tiffany for 14 months. She had been recruited not from a major corporation as he'd told me, but through a personal connection formed at a conference 8 months before she joined, 3 months into my pregnancy. The bathroom surveillance policy had been her idea, and he had approved it. The facial recognition blacklist had been set up 2 days after Evergreen confirmed the signing date. He had been planning my termination since before I collapsed on the street outside the office, which meant that while I was in a hospital bed having been felled by a pregnancy I was carrying, while working myself into the ground for our shared dream, he was in the office setting the timeline for my removal. I read through the documents with my lawyer in a conference room and felt not new pain but comprehensive, documented confirmation of something I had already metabolized. Grief requires some uncertainty to sustain itself. Remove the uncertainty entirely and what remains is something cleaner if colder. The settlement was substantial. My lawyer argued, correctly, with evidence, that my contributions were foundational and the termination discriminatory and legally indefensible on multiple grounds. And Aldrich's team, after 2 months of resistance, arrived at a number that reflected what 6 years of my labor had actually been worth. He paid it with the tight-jawed silence of a man who had believed the story would end differently. Tiffany left the company 4 months later. I heard she had found the reality of a struggling firm less appealing than the promise of a dominant one. I had no feelings about this whatsoever. The twist I did not see coming arrived in the form of a phone call from Margaret Voss 6 months after the settlement. She asked if I had considered starting my own firm. She said she had watched me operate for 3 years and had always believed I was the engine behind Aldrich's success, and that she had a network of contacts who felt the same way, and that if I was interested, she would like to be my first investor. I sat with my phone pressed to my ear and thought about the kitchen table and the borrowed printer and the apartment I had sold, and I said yes before she finished the sentence. I registered the company on a Tuesday. Daniel sent flowers. My mother, who had never entirely trusted Aldrich and had been too loyal to say so, came over and cried in my kitchen in the specific way that means I am so relieved rather than I am sad. I named the company after the street my parents' apartment had been on. Because it had funded everything, because it deserved to be remembered, because the things that cost you most should mean the most in the end. The baby came in April. A girl. She has my eyes and, from what I can tell at 4 months, my particular quality of focused attention that people have described variously as intensity, coldness and frightening, and which I have decided to call simply paying attention, and which I intend to encourage in her completely. Aldrich sees her on the schedule our lawyers agreed upon. He shows up on time and is appropriate with her, and I think on some level genuinely loves her, which is more than I expected and exactly what she deserves, and I've made my peace with the complicated arithmetic of that. I built one company from nothing and handed it to someone else's ambition because I loved him and trusted the architecture of us. I am building a second one now, with my own name on the door, and Margaret Voss's network behind me and a 4-month-old, who sleeps in a bassinet beside my desk on the days I work from home. The difference between the two experiences is the difference between building something to give away and building something to keep. I know which one I prefer. I will not make the same mistake twice. I have a very good memory. My daughter has my eyes, and we are just getting started.